Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with Matt Christman. So on today's episode, we're going to explore what is probably one of the most consequential decisions in modern history, and certainly in the history of the left, which was the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or SPD's decision to vote for war credits in World War I, and essentially to abandon the international class struggle, which had been the basic, the teleology, the telos of Marxism. So World War I breaks out in June 1914. And Matt, why don't you describe a little what happened? Why did this war break out? What was going on? Who did what?
Well, it was the culmination of a process of military buildup between the various imperial states of Europe as they scrambled for access to the resources of the globe, but also the territory within Europe itself. It was a period when the relatively recently united German Empire was making an effort to gain parity or to even eclipse the power of England on the high seas, and where all of this brinksmanship was being carried out in the context of these alliance systems between states meant to prevent any one power from becoming too belligerent. But what ended up happening is that it was that very alliance system that triggered a continent-wide conflagration, which began after the assassination of the Austrian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo by Serb nationalists, because the war's proximate cause was what Bismarck predicted it would be: some damn business in the Balkans, because the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans had led to a scramble for control of those territories by the European powers. Russia was seeking to position itself as the guardian of Slavs everywhere and was looking to try to make a grab for the Dardanelles, while Austria-Hungary was trying to keep its multi-ethnic empire together and to extend its influence into Bosnia.
And so you get the end of this concert of Europe, this post-Napoleonic peace. It wasn't actually much of a peace, and I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point. There was actually quite a few wars over the course of the 19th century, and this peace comes to an end with the assassination of the Archduke. And it's really important to emphasize, and I think this mirrors what's happening today, was that in Germany, and particularly amongst the German middle classes, the war was actually embraced significantly, particularly at the beginning. It was seen as a way to finally break through the bourgeois norms, the bourgeois civilization that had led the end of the cycle, the fin de siècle, the turn of the 20th century, to appear so boring. And the idea amongst many people in Germany was that you'd actually be able to use the war to basically move from particular interests into new collectivities, that you'd be actually able to express meaning, to express a romantic valor in the sacrifice of war. And the war was actually embraced by a lot of people at the time.
Not just in Germany, but all across Europe, wherever the war was, wherever it was time to declare war, the popular energies were all excited, because everywhere in Europe, the logic of capitalism was draining meaning from life, like by the day, and people were aware of that, and among the working class, that was expressed in this burgeoning socialist movement, the socialist political formations that were coming into being. But among the middle class, there's this more individuated desire to transcend the mechanisms of capitalism and the alienations that they produced. And as has traditionally been the case, war is the fantasy realm where all the solid and stodgy elements of existence sort of melt away, and you live this new life that is more at the quick, that is more animal, that is not a prison of rationality, and that that the experience of the experience of undergoing that then can transmogrify a alienated social existence into a collective experienced one where people have bonded through fire and come out forged into something else.
Right. There's something more organic. There's this idea that war is a more organic experience. And so I think it's important to view World War I as two things. One, it's really the end of feudalism and the aristocracy. The aristocracy was dealt its fatal blow, I'd say, in the French Revolution and in the Industrial Revolution that came quickly after, Eric Hobsbawm's famous dual revolution of the French and Industrial Revolutions. But, it kept on limping along, and World War I is really when a lot of them literally just get annihilated and killed. So it could be viewed as the period on the aristocracy, but it's also an important turning point in the history, as Matt just suggested, of the bourgeoisie, where things could have gone a different way.
Yeah, this is the last gasp of aristocratic rule, and as with everything else in the history of modern Europe, what ends up destroying them is that interstate competition. That it was interstate competition that led them to unleash these forces of capitalism that ended up undermining them and empowering a different emergent social force of the bourgeois. And then they resisted it to one degree or another. And you see this process whereby in the more advanced capitalist countries, the aristocracy is essentially either decapitated or bought out or some combination of that. Whereas further east, traditional forms of monarchical rule hold on until this point, but all of them are smashed. All the idols are smashed by the war because it turns out it's not a very efficient way to run a government.
Absolutely not. And so you could view the beginning of World War I as this sort of cleansing moment, and people really recognize it as a time. It really reminds me of our own era where people are essentially looking for something meaningful. You know, they're fighting anti-fascism and all those things. So there's a lot of comparisons or analogies that I think could be drawn. But this really brings us to our hinge points. Early August 1914 in the German parliament. And this is really important because it's at this moment, on August 3rd and August 4th, 1914, when the Social Democratic Party of Germany, again, the SPD, one of the most august socialist parties in the world, one of the most important ones, the socialist.
The model for all the other ones.
The model for all the other ones, the Socialist Party of Marx's own country, decide in a world historical decision to vote with all the other parties in Germany in favor of war credits. Now, at the time, the SPD defends this by saying that the war is a defensive one. It's against Russia. It's against Tsarist reactionary Russia, and so you needed to do it. But from the larger long-term historical perspective, and certainly from Matt and my perspective, this is when the SPD formally abandons its commitment to international class struggle in the hopes that the German working classes would ally with other national working classes to prevent First World War. And in essence, the party begins to express its commitment to being a national party as opposed to an international party based on working class struggle. And this is, I think it's important to emphasize, a betrayal of the rank and file. Right after, as the war breaks out in June, July, August, there's actually significant opposition from the German working classes against the war. And in fact, that leads to a division of the SPD, where in 1917, the party splits between an SPD, the majority SPD is what the original party is called, and an independent SPD. And you get, basically the sundering of the radical and reformist strands of the party to some degree. And the original, the majority SPD, becomes a party that rules during Weimar, and some might say didn't react effectively to Hitler's rise. But we're going to suppose here is, what if the SPD didn't vote in favor of war credits? What if the party actually had significantly refused to ally with the rest of the German political parties, and instead of becoming a national party, committed itself to an international working class politics? And I think to understand why this would be so important, we have to think what Marx wanted and what Marx thought the role of Germany would be.
Yeah, so Germany is the model for the rising working class consciousness that takes hold all throughout Europe as the Industrial Revolution intensifies in the 19th century, because obviously the fact that Marx is German is key to this. He is conceiving his notions in a context of Germany, and the emergence of the German state after the Franco-Prussian War created a dynamic, rapidly industrializing economy that had such a febrile working class movement and so much agitation and so much effective propagandization and ideological formation that the German ruling class broke really with much of the rest of the continental European tradition in the 1880s and actually legalized the socialist movement, which had been illegal until that point, instituted a series of social reform measures to alleviate a lot of their most persistent complaints, and brought the working class into the political fold by allowing the Social Democrats to run for office, to sit in parliament, and very quickly they became the sole political organ of the working class in Germany, and that really was the blueprint that Marx had predicted.
Right. Because Marx really, and this is, I think, when we start talking about the Soviet Union in another episode, this is really critical because Marx, a lot of the Marxist theory of revolution, a lot of the Marxian understanding of history, in my opinion at least, and there are disagreements over this, but really depended on essentially Central Europe being the site of revolution. It really depended on Central Europe being the space where the working class would become the subject and the object of history, where this proletarianizing population that is moving to the cities for the first time in the 19th century, that is pushing this new dynamic thing called capitalism, is going to become conscious of itself, seize the means of production, and instigate a world revolution. And of course, what happens over the course of the 19th century, particularly by the fin de siècle, is that the working class movement begins to be channeled into political parties. And the SPD is really, I think, the most important working class political party on earth.
Yeah.
And so it's really in the SPD that the hopes for international revolution are placed, and I think rightly, especially when we see what happens when the revolution occurs in the decrepit Tsarist empire, the Russian Empire, and what happens with the Soviet Union. And I think one of the reasons that occurred as it did was because the SPD voted to essentially become a national party. So, Matt, what do you think happens? Let's say the SPD, it's August 1914, and the leaders are like, fuck this. We're not going to go along with this. We're not going to become a national party. We're going to make links to the French working class. We're going to make links to the British working class. We're going to try to reach out to the Russian Empire and the peasantry there and try to prevent a World War I. What do you think would have happened? Or at least what possibilities would that have presented to people at the time?
It would, at the very least, have given the socialist movements and political leadership of those in the other European countries a chance to do something other than what they did. It became, once the German Socialist Democratic Party votes for war credits, it dooms all other working class parties in Europe to follow suit, because
you have to.
At that point, it has been fully foreclosed because you're essentially asking your people to unilaterally disarm in the face of a German military machine that is at that point like the national enemy of France entirely.
And also very successful over the course of the 19th century, the Austro-Prussian War, the Franco-Prussian War, extremely, extremely successful military.
And ruled over by a fucking Kaiser, I mean, the defensive democracy propaganda from the Allies of World War I is, of course, pretty silly, especially when you consider Tsarist Russia is a key component of the coalition. But it's certainly true that if you're on the other side of the Rhine and you're looking at the Bosch and here's and the your fellow workers have decided that they're going to back the war, you have no choice. There is no other alternative. You have to convince yourself that this is actually a defense of war, and that there's some sort of benefit to this, that you're not betraying socialism. But in that context, the choice has been made for you by the Germans. That's not to say that there would have been some inevitable uprising across Europe in opposition, because nationalist sentiments had been the real foundational. They had been the passions that had replaced the religious wars of early modern Europe in the 19th century, and were nothing to sneeze at, and were present all throughout every element of European life, including in the working classes of all of these countries. So there is a strong tide that you would be pushing against, which is what, more than anything, made them decide to not do it, to not press their luck, as it were.
Right. And I think you could look at the 19th century from the perspective of 2021 as, to some degree, a battle between class consciousness and national consciousness.
Yes. And something's got to replace God.
Right.
God died, and there has to be something to fill the space, something to organize your understanding of the world around you, to create hosts of angels and demons to negotiate your life between, and those were the two offerings. Race comes into it more in the 20th century, but at that time it is nationalism and class. And that contest was moving in the direction of class for many of the workers of Europe, but it was certainly not universal.
Right, and the whole Marxist prediction, in my opinion at least, was premised on that something like World War I couldn't happen.
Yeah.
Was that the whole thing was that the workers wouldn't do what they did, which was, and I actually want to underline, this is where it gets into complicated territory, whether it was the workers or sort of the professionalized workers of the party leadership. And this is where you get a lot of...
see, that's the issue.
This is the issue.
This is where, if you want to say, this is the
DSA versus the Amazon workers.
Yeah.
DSA is voting, or in the sense that, like, the people who are of a particular economic class in general are voting for this social formation, this class formation, which they're supposed to represent.
It was the legalization of the party that made the SDP the power it was, but that decision also over time bourgeoisified the party, in that its leadership were no longer workers in a material sense. The people who made decisions, both in the party itself and in the labor unions that supported it, because it wasn't just a party; it was a party that ruled through a collaboration with labor unions. The leaders of both of those groups were not workers in any sense. They did not go to factories. They did not perform the alienating work that Marx talks about. That is the thing that radicalizes people and creates class consciousness.
And workers used to actually call them in German the dicken Bonzen, the fat cats. And so there was a lot of talk at the time about the dicken Bonzen basically betraying the working class.
Because that fact is meaningful, because when the decision point comes, when the summer of 1914 comes, the calculus of your fat cats within the party and in the labor movement is going to be different than those of the workers. For one thing, there's much more likely that they're going to actually have to fight this war and get shot during it. But also, if they do decide to vote against credits and to resist the war, they will likely lose their positions in parliament.
Absolutely.
They will likely lose there is a very good chance they'll get arrested.
Right. The Socialist Party was illegal for a lot of the 19th century in Germany. Literally illegal.
It was well understood, especially at the top, that the Social Democratic Party existed at the sufferance of the state, and that sufferance could be removed. And doing something like refusing to vote for war credits in a continent-wide conflagration would count as a reason to do that. And that, I think, more than anything, determined the decision. Is they had convinced themselves by that point that they were on a reformist road to communism that would not require revolution. That they had fully metabolized the Bernstein revisionism, because the thing that convinced them, and I really do think that the thing that convinced them of that was nothing logical, rational. It was not a grasp of the immortal science. It was their full bellies. It was their pocket watches. It was the fact that by pursuing this course, they personally had advanced, which they were able to, in their minds, conflate to the advance of the working class in general.
So let's say for some reason the Dick and Bonds and they all wake up one day and they're like, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to do the Marxist working class. What happens? Do we get, first of all, World War I probably can't happen if there's a general strike in Germany. In the summer of 1914, if there's a huge general strike, there probably can't be that sort of invasion of the Western Front and these various fights that happen. So what happens? Is there a way for the workers of the world to unite, or is that an impossibility? But let's say they do unite. What then? World War I doesn't happen. Is there a European-wide revolution? Is there a linking up with Lenin and the Soviet Union? What things could have gone differently if it didn't occur as in the way that it did?
I would say that as historical counterfactuals go, this one is a little overdetermined. Like I think that the fact that the war hadn't happened yet kind of doomed any kind of alternative course, because nobody thought it was going to be the war that it turned out to be. The reason that they call it, sort of a peace period after the Council of Vienna isn't that there weren't wars. There were. It's just that the prolonged, years-long, massively bloody warfare of the Napoleonic era was over. Wars of the 19th century, later 19th century in Europe, were largely very short. One season, one campaign, maybe one or two big battles, and then people signed a peace treaty. And there was a generalized understanding that this war would be like that. And its decisions are made in that context. Like, we look at now and we see World War I as this apocalyptic explosion at the heart of capitalism, and the moment that the working class had been waiting for, the moment to come to a fundamental conflict with capitalism. And that is the reality that is often masked by the day-to-day necessities of living in a society and doing your part as a lawful citizen in one way or another, even if you consider yourself a radical, is that all political action, all party building, all labor activism. It might be narrowly about winning an election. It might be narrowly about winning concessions from an employer in a strike. But the long-term goal needs to be marshaling forces for the moment of conflict, the final irrevocable moment of conflict with capitalism.
To transcend the system.
And that is what got obscured by the success of the SDP. As Bane said in Batman, the fucking victory has defeated you. They lost that urgency at the top of the party, and convinced themselves that no, we can legislate our way to reforms that will take the power away from capitalists and fundamentally change our relationship to one another, which is the thing that is hardest to keep in your head on a day-to-day level, is that socialism would require a social transformation that is by definition disruptive, wildly disruptive, and at the expense of a class of people who currently have concentrated power.
Because of the Socialist Party.
That will not give it up.
Right.
And so, while you may decide that elections are worth pursuing, and they often are. They're often the only thing to do in a given moment. You can't say, well, because we're trying to do a world revolution, we can't do elections. Like, no, you have to build capacity. But you're building capacity for a confrontation. And I think that the leadership of the SDP convinced themselves that this wasn't it.
So then this raises an interesting question, particularly as we pursue this podcast. Will we come up against certain moments that are overdetermined and that are impossible? Because essentially what we're saying here to some significant degree is that the workers' revolution that Marx envisioned was impossible, that it was going to have to be some sort of war between actually existing nation states which emerged in the 19th and early 20th century, and that it was basically impossible for there to be a workers' revolt against the leaders, thereby making the Marxist telos impossible to fulfill in actual history.
Yeah.
Unverheimlich der hat Zähne und die trägt
By saying that it's overdetermined, we're essentially saying that another world wasn't possible, that there was no way that there was ever going to be workers' revolution.
I would say to that that the period from 14 to 45 is the deciding time, and that what ended up happening was not an inevitability, basically, and that means that the Marxist telos is in my mind still alive, and in the future we'll talk more about this, and that's why I think that the real moment when history gets liquid and when you can imagine alternatives to what we got is in the aftermath of World War I, because I think one of the things.
So World War I is inevitable, basically. What we're coming at, there has to be some sort of conflagration between the declining European empires,
and there has to be a violent dissolution with the system as it exists, because those workers of Germany, they might not have been too keen on going to war, and many of them might have been opposed to it. But would you have had sufficient will in the German working class to say no to this war that the rest of the continent is starting, say no to the nationalist identity that many of them had imbued by that point, and then keep saying no in the face of what would be obvious and immediate and violent repression by the state, and then hope basically that you have inspired the working classes of those other countries to a point of solidarity, even though at that point, not just for the rulers, not just for the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, but for ordinary workers, the revisionist road had shown results. They had gotten concessions from labor. Their lives were less alienated and less miserable than they had been in the earlier days of capitalism. There was an ameliorative effect going on. Now that's thanks to the spoils of empire and the creation of international markets that are like changing, allowing more surplus to flow to workers than like Marx had imagined in a closed system of national capitalism.
Right. Very critical point, actually.
Yeah, and so there was still something for them in the system as it existed that would have made the risk of saying no to the war, especially when you don't know what that war is. You don't know how bad it's going to be. You don't know how disruptive it's going to be. A bridge too far. And I think not only were the Social Democrats too comfortable to make that decision, they were too unsure of the actions of the other parties in Europe, because they had their international, they had their second international, they had their meetings, but they didn't really have a coordination between each other.
And I wanted to underline that because I think this is one of the biggest questions of left-wing politics in modern history, which is how do you actually build those sorts of international or transnational connections that that feel literally as organic as the connection to the nation.
Exactly.
Right. And to some degree, this is the big question of left-wing politics that we haven't answered, and frankly haven't even come close to answering. And so that question, I think, was initiated. All the theory before 1914 is that it's going to build there, that you're going to get this international, transnational working class consciousness.
And it seemed to be moving in that direction, but then before those bonds had been made, before the connective tissue had really built up, you have this decision. You have this lightning strike in the form of the war. And because of the lack of development along those lines, and because of the lure of war that's always there, and it's certainly in Europe, my God, those guys love going to war. At least they did until they were like, you know what? Enough. Although honestly, now maybe they want to go to war again. Who knows?
Well, they really enjoyed all the responsibility to protect. The second they were able to bomb the global South, they love that stuff. The ICC loves trying people.
Oh, they love trying Africans.
Africans,
it's their favorite thing.
It's their favorite thing.
And then bombing
Europeans
Slavs
love that
once in a while.
Yeah. Well, in the Balkans, we return again to the Balkans.
Yeah, but in the absence of faith that they have created a thing that can withstand the reaction that would cause, they do the safe. They make the safe decision, what feels to them like the safe decision. And if they hadn't, I think you likely get some degree of coordinated resistance in the form of strikes and stuff. But my instinct, from my knowledge of the moment, is that it would have guttered out And the war still would have happened.
So if we're arguing that World War I is overdetermined, and to some degree, when we're looking at 1914 as a synchronic moment, I agree. Was there anything that could have happened over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries to make that different? Because this is also the big question. Or was the fact of essentially colonialism serving as an sort of escape valve of class tension within the major powers of Europe, the UK, France, and Germany, essentially prevented the types of transnational solidarity that would have been necessary to make the SPD vote against war credits?
I think that is the part of that. That's what has always saved European capitalism. I mean, it's what created European capitalism. It was the plunder of the Western Hemisphere that created the capital formations that built Western capitalism. It was the money from the New World fueled the wars of the 16th and 17th centuries that created the Westphalian system, and then it was exploiting the colonial properties that created the trade networks that built capitalism in the North Atlantic, where it then spread throughout the entire continent and then the world.
And also creates, which is so important to us today, consumers.
Yes,
right. You get the rise of fashion, you get the rise of mass consumption, you get the rise of mass politics over the course of the 19th century, and all of these things are working to mitigate class consciousness.
Yes, like the marginal revolution in economics,
right?
That says you shouldn't think about value in terms of the labor that goes into it, but in terms of its the value as in the eye of a consumer. That is an epistemic shift. You are no longer viewing the individual, the citizen, as a producer, but as a consumer, and even though they are still producing, they aren't thinking of themselves as producers. They're thinking of themselves as consumers, because the death spiral of immiseration that Marx sees in capitalism and is part of capitalism
is objectively happening.
Subjectively is not occurring in Europe because of imperialism, because of the opening of markets elsewhere, and the bringing in of cheap resources into Europe to be consumed. And so you have this battle between class consciousness and this consumer identity, which is by definition nationalist.
Right.
Because you are not a consumer. You are a consumer in a national context, in a specific cultural context that does not have the inherent solidarity and linkages that the idea of being a worker does.
So this is the big question. I mean, we're getting to enormous questions of Marxist theory in the very first episode, but why is that so powerful? Right? Why is national organic connection to a land, or envisioned organic connection to a land, an imagined community, as Benedict Anderson famously put it? What proved so much more powerful about that ideology as opposed to viewing things through class, viewing things through an international class? Because this is, I do think, what Marx predicted, and he was right objectively, I would say, about everything. Marx objectively gets most things right, not 100%, but he the actual course of actually existing capitalism to a remarkable degree basically followed the course that Marx predicted in the middle of the 19th century.
Yeah, absolutely.
But where Marx's biggest failing, I think, was the subjective experience of actually living workers on the ground. And this, to me, is the entire counterfactual of European history, which is that nationalism, consumption, over time race, really came to supplant and move away class identity as a founding organizational principle of individual lives.
I think that the root of the answer comes to the fact that nationalism comes first, because these notions are built. These notions of identity are new, right? They are built up among these people whose ancestors throughout most of European history had an identity that was fixed to an area of land, and that was determined by that, like peasants and landowners. And that's basically your division of humanity. And it's all defined by these localities. And these abstract notions are not even conceivable. They're unnecessary, and they don't relate to the conditions of life. But then capitalism begins churning up the earth and bringing people from these fixed relations into either literally bringing them into cities, or through mass media and mass culture, if they're staying on the land, bringing them into these notions through that.
These imagined spaces of community, essentially.
And so the place where these new identities are being formed is in these cities, and the people doing the formation at first are not workers. They're the people who have time to sit around in coffee shops and wonder about, like, okay, what do we have now? If we don't have if we don't have God, what the hell? What are we doing here? And because the people making that culture at that point are not workers, when they are grasping for symbols and ideas and concepts, they're going to they're going to not be in conflict with capitalism because they're being born out of it, and it's being made by people who are functionally within capitalism.
And also, literally, this is where liberalism also starts in the salon, and capitalism and liberalism are all linked to Enlightenment ideas about rationality, about reason, about order, about progress.
Right.
And I think that's also really critical to understand.
Yes, we're all individuals. We're all negotiating our relationships with each other as strangers, fundamentally. So how will we come back into reacquaintance with each other?
Right, with self-interests that are naturally in conflict with other self-interests.
And the only real material that is amenable to capitalism and that is relatable to the experience of this urban bourgeois and the people in the urban bourgeois, and then the culture creators around that bourgeois are these national myths and identities and languages that they can build a story around, a narrative of personhood, of identity, of belonging. I mean, Benedict Anderson's work on this points out that nationalism is very much a media phenomenon, that media being newspapers, and that the creation of mass, cheap newspapers, all written by these same idle scribes in the cities, inscribes these ideas. And then while this is happening, the working class is also being created, but with less access to the tools of cultural production, by definition, because they're working. They don't have. They're living the lives that Marx and Engels were describing of immiseration, of their lives stripped of any time for personal reflection, leisure, advancement of any kind.
And this is why Marx underlines the importance of the working class becoming conscious of itself.
Yes.
This is the critical thing that was supposed to happen in the 19th century.
And it did, but it came in the backdraft of the creation of these national identities. So first, if you are coming into being as a worker in these countries, you are finding yourself first templated with these language and religious and national identities, and then you are also a worker. And because you are working in the conditions that Marx describes of close proximity, of social homogeneity, people start creating culture that way. They are able to. They steal some time away. They start organizing to improve their lot with their employer, giving themselves both some space and time to reflect, and also evidence of the effectiveness of organized action, and also an understanding of who they're in opposition to, an understanding of where their lives' miseries come from, not abstract enemies and in foreign countries, their employer who speaks the same
their
language,
boss, yeah.
comes from the same country, has the same flag, believes the same things about the nation, but who is the face of their exploitation. And then in that process, through this struggle, now working class people start writing newspapers.
Right. Professionalization. Yeah, exactly.
Start doing the things that the bourgeois were doing 30, 40 years earlier. And they are now creating a new narrative with a new understanding that was created within the capitalism, but is now a counter-hegemony generated by a working class. Like the newspapers bought by working class people, not funded by the state, organic to this social formation. And so you have within capitalism this social formation that observes a lot of the forms, but has this fundamentally different content, and that generates this different identity.
And so then the issue is, if that continued unabated, then we could have expected the SPD to vote against the war credits. But I think the problem is that what happens is the professionalization which occurs throughout society, which is essentially, in my opinion, just a new instantiation of the Marxian division of labor.
Yeah, exactly.
Where effectively you have the creation of party structures and party bureaucracies, where the existence of party bureaucrats they essentially have their own logic, where in some sense the existence of their very jobs depends on the continuation of class exploitation.
Yes, it's true. The people whose job it is basically to get the working class ready for the moment of the real moment of crisis,
to abolish themselves,
would have to be operating out of a desire to abolish their own selves, abolish their livelihoods, which are relatively comfortable. Like they got to live lives where they lived in bourgeois comfort, but got to feel like they were on the right side of history, which is the greatest dream you can imagine. My God, us sitting
we're
here.
living it, baby.
This is like, if you want to understand the online left of the last the last 5-6 years, it is this terminal crisis of the middle class in America, and people wanting to feel like they are helping while not giving up any of the pleasures,
any of the privileges
associated with being a bourgeois consumer. So it's a lot to ask of people, and in fact, it's not really possible. Like, that is why so many Marxists would focus on the need for a continual infusion of like energy from the rank and file to keep the socialist movement from ossifying that way. And the thing that made that happen, the thing that kept the party responsive, was really its degree of discomfort, its degree of criminality, the degree to which that they were the subject of oppression and violence from the state, the degree that they were kept from enjoying the full fruits of bourgeois life, even though they weren't workers, which is what happened with the Russian Social Democratic Party. But in the German case, you had people who were living as bourgeois without bourgeois neuroses, because they got to think they were working on the side of history. Because bourgeois neuroses is being addicted to a life that you know is wrong, and then having to figure out
how to live with that.
And that defines like the cultural production of the middle class for the last 200 years,
especially today as we're approaching another moment of terminal crisis. Yeah.
But then within that embedded, you have this other this little mini bourgeois that is hypothetically answerable to this movement, but that in practice is making individual decisions without real accountability, that are going to be motivated by their not even conscious desire to maintain their position within a system rather than to see it abolished.
Right, which begins to suggest that the institutionalization or domestication of radical movements essentially works against them, at least in capitalism, which is perhaps one of the biggest questions that we're facing today, because I don't see, especially in 2021, any possibility of the type of violent revolution that we'll talk about in the next episode that happened in 1918, 1919 Germany. That sort of thing is impossible. So you have the institutionalization and mechanization of a party structure that inevitably works against its very existence, inevitably works against what you're trying to go for, which is a transcendence of capitalism. And I think this is one of the major problems that, the modern period of political parties, the modern period of elections presents to those of us who want to genuinely transcend capitalism, which is, how do you channel that sort of righteous working class anger and rage into an institutional form that maintains its revolutionary capacities? It's never happened.
Yeah.
So I think this is one of the biggest, problems facing people who genuinely want to transcend capitalism, not just have, a kinder, nicer capitalism with a nicer face type situation. And I think that World War I is really the sort of the apex moment of that, which is that decision, the SPD's decision to vote for war credit, to just underline the very tension of having a working class political party. Not that you don't need it, you do need it, and that's the problem, because there's no escaping, there's no moving outside of the beast, there's no moving outside of the system.
Yeah, and I would say that that it was the experience of World War I, the actual experience of what it was, not what people thought it was going to be in 1914 when that decision was made, that offers the real what if, the real alternative, when the people of Germany and all of Europe had experienced what,
or like, holy shit,
like
Jesus Christ,
like this is what.
This is what we get.
This is what we get.
This is industrial war.
We are building machines just to kill each other.
Right. Very efficiently.
Yeah. For the benefit of a decrepit, sclerotic ruling class who has no connection to us whatsoever. But the thing is that realization could only have come through the experience of the war.
Right. Right. You needed that war. And there's no way to avoid that.
And honestly, the actions of the SDP after the war really show you the degree to which the bourgeoisification of the party had become had just poisoned it and doomed it in many ways, because it was we'll talk about this later, but it was social democrats who created the nucleus of Nazism in the form of the Freikorps. Like, they were the ones who had the idea to put down a rebellion of workers, sailors, and soldiers, the same ones who had taken power in St. Petersburg, and put it down by collecting the most damaged, violence-addicted victims of the Eastern Front and Western Fronts, and throw them into battle. And then the culture that they created there ended up becoming the culture of the Nazi Party.
And we'll talk about that in the next episode, but I also just wanted to underline a couple of things. That already started during the war, because once the SPD split, the majority SPD allied with the Catholic Center Party and the Liberal Progressive Party. So you begin to get these formations that are going to defend the status quo and begin to pursue a path not necessarily towards socialism, but to a finer capitalism.
And honestly, the fact that after the war, the center of gravity of the SDP was making those decisions, was seeing the revolutions in the streets, was seeing the Kiel mutiny and seeing the Berlin marchers, and says, let's get Ernst Jünger in here. That to me, more than anything, proves that there was no other historically realistic option than them voting war credits in 1914. If that experience of that war was not enough to shake from their perch of sort of bourgeois self-satisfaction, if they were that, even if anything else after that, even more
revolution,
more confirmed, even more dedicated to the status quo after that experience, then it's very hard to imagine anything making them vote otherwise in 1914.
So then, why don't we close on this question? And it's a big one. What did Marx get wrong? And I think, in my opinion, and I think I'm not new here, basically all this Marxist theory after World War I is essentially addressing this question, but he didn't fully appreciate the other subjective identities that people would feel organic connection to, this sort of teleology between the lived experience of being a worker and the connections that one draws with other workers by virtue of that lived experience across other identity groups proved to be incorrect. So there is a problem in his conception of human nature or his conception of psychology, I would say. And again, I just want to underline genius, one of the smartest men of all time, certainly in the last 200 years, and basically everything he objectively predicted got right. But there was a subjective lacking there that I think is evident from the beginning, which might be a bit of a controversial claim. I'm curious what you think.
I don't know if I would even say that he was wrong about it in so much as he at a certain point, he was sketching out this absolutely accurate diagram of what capitalism was.
Right.
Like
as a system.
As a system.
He got it right.
But that system is composed of people.
Right.
And there is never going to be a systematic analysis of the human experience
could account for that
has predictive power, because that's where the fucking butterflies come in. Like, we make decisions. Man makes his own history, but not as he chooses, as Marx said. It's like we are, if only out of our ignorance, we are free to make decisions in our lives. Like, because Marxism talks about material interests and how that is what motivates people. And that is true. But we don't know what our material interests are. That is not a thing that exists objectively. We have an idea of what our material interests are.
Or how they're filtered through various things. And that's filtered
through a million different things that give us ideas that are individuated. And while people sort into positions in a society based on their demographics and their experiences and their relationship to a mode of production, there still are people at crucial points who are going to make decisions that are not determinable and not predictable.
Right.
And that is why that's what history is the intersection of these machines, these determined machines, and then the humans within them. And that is why I think that counterfactual history is so fascinating, because if you understand that is the how history works, then you can always look back at history and find the points where contingency emerged, where the people in the place are close enough to consequential decisions, but also subjective enough that something else could have happened. And so I'd say that what Marx, in a material sense, just didn't process enough was what imperialism would do.
Right.
Not so much anything he got wrong about human nature, just stuff that you can't predict about what people who have whatever a human nature is are going to do in a given moment.
Right.
But the thing that changed, the actual equation of European capitalism that as he understood it, was changed by the introduction of these markets, more importantly, these places where hyper exploitation could go on outside of the metropole, outside of these civic concepts. Like, you could have a situation in Germany where or in France or in England where the worst work, the most alienating and miserable work is not being done there.
Right.
Not being done by Germans or English people. It's being done by subject people who have been racially and geographically erased from your conception of humanity.
Right.
And the benefits of their labor, their surplus of their labor, can then be enjoyed at low cost by workers who now get to view themselves as consumers in a way that they wouldn't have if the grinding immiseration of capitalism was still concentrated in Europe,
right?
And sustained in Europe the way that Marx imagined.
And it created new relationships of domination and exploitation between the metropole and the colony.
Yes.
That I think is right. That I think makes it overdetermined. And I think one of the most interesting things that we're going to be able to do in this show is essentially identify which moments were overdetermined and which moments were actually plastic.
Precisely.
According to what the relationship essentially between structure and agent, and the restricted agency of people, like you said, as Marx said, living in a world, but not entirely of their own making. And this is what we'll explore. And next time we'll come back and we'll check out the German revolutions of 1819, when certain different choices could have been made and the world could have been a totally different place.
Absolutely.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Hinge Points. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with Matt Christman. We're going to explore in this one one of the most important hinge points in modern history, and probably one of the most important hinge points in the history of the left, and that is the failure of the German revolutions of 1918, 1919 to take off in a way that would have begun some type of genuine socialist or communist European republic. Matt, why do you think this is such an important issue?
Because the subsequent events show that the socialist movement, the European-wide socialist movement, never really recovered from this failure. That the model of socialism in one country that emerged out of the Soviet Union in response to the failure of a European revolution to catch on was always doomed. And while I don't think there's any point in condemning the Bolsheviks and the Communist Party of Russia for the decisions they made, and given the constraints they were under, their improvisations were all being done in the aftermath of a catastrophic defeat that, for obvious reasons, people were not too excited to accept, because you still have to live, you still have to struggle, and it's always worthy to continue struggling. But the context of struggle after the failure of the German Revolution and the consolidation of capitalist power in Europe, and the beginning of a state competition, basically between a communist Russia and a unified capitalism throughout the rest of Europe and the United States we saw what it led to. We saw the failure of that model to export meaningful, coordinated revolutionary movements outside of the Soviet Union to support them meaningfully. The Spanish Civil War is a good example of that. And looking back, especially with the knowledge that the October Revolution was started with the specific objective of kicking off a European-wide revolution, that clearly the failure for one to occur in a really meaningful sense doomed the greatest possibility we had, the historical opening that was predicted by Marx. Now we're living sort of in this new world that Marx could not have predicted because it involved conditions that he could not have foreseen. He foresaw a continent-wide crisis of capitalism, which you saw in the first half of the 20th century. And we did not get a socialist revolution sweeping through those areas. And the place that all started to fall apart was in Germany.
Right. And I think it's important what you said to underline is that in a real way, I think the history of the left moved in a different direction after the failure of the 1819 revolutions. We're really living in that hangover. And a good way to understand it is that these revolutions and their failure, and particularly as we'll see, the majority socialists, the centrist or right-wing socialists' willingness to essentially compromise with bourgeois capital, laid the foundations for the consolidation of the North Atlantic capitalist world, which would eventually rise to total dominance at the hands of the American empire after 1945, a genuine global dominance of the likes that the world has never seen, so that capitalism in a real way has taken over the world, that there really is today in the United States of 2021, in the globe of 2021, no genuine alternative. And I think, and we think that this really was pushed on this path-dependent journey with the failure of these revolutions. So why don't we go back and just provide a context for the revolution? Because I think a lot of people, particularly on the online left, are kind of fantasists about the possibility of revolution, and they constantly talk about it happening. And it's, I think, important to understand what types of conditions actually lead to revolution.
Unser Blut ist nicht ruhig! Unser Blut kocht der.
So it's late September 1918, and basically the German high command, the German military, recognizes that the war was militarily lost. And actually, it's General Erich Ludendorff, who people might recognize from his later associations with a famous man named Adolf Hitler, who decided that there needed to be domestic transformations in German society, and essentially that there needed to be some form of democratic government in Germany, so that Germany would be able to negotiate with Woodrow Wilson in a way that wouldn't, totally destroy the country. So that's sort of the geopolitical conditions. And within Germany itself, and this is really critical, the war had raised expectations that there actually needed to be more democracy within the country itself, because World War I was, in my opinion, there are antecedents, but it's really the first total war. It's really the first war where all of society is mobilized in order to fight this world-ending conflict.
Yes, and that process of total mobilization brings with it, as you said, expectations of democratic control of governance. War traditionally has been the chief agent of mobilizing state capacity. And like with most wars, the World War I, even as it was being massively destroying, was also building this capacity for state coordination. And the suggestion there is always, if we can do this in war conditions, maybe we can do it in peace conditions. Maybe we can have a national social basis for our economic planning instead of a individuated capitalist one. And so you see throughout the war a ratcheting up of demands for democracy, especially in the context of a monarchy. And it really is pretty brilliant of the high command guys like Ludendorff to, with one hand, accede to the democratic impulse, and at the other, pin a scapegoat for the failure of the war that does not encompass them, the military leadership and the capitalist classes that they represent.
Yeah, so one of the most important things that people like Ludendorff are thinking toward the end of World War I is that they want the military, which they kind of understand the war is lost, that it's going to be very difficult for Germany to win this thing. They nonetheless want the military to remain and retain its hold on German society. You have this civil peace during World War I, military discipline continues to define German life, and people like Ludendorff basically want to save the honor of the German military so that when the war ends, it's still able to exert significant control on German society. And that is, in fact, what happens, even though the Versailles Treaty really does restrict the German military to the famous 100,000 man army. The military is still seen with significant honor in German society. People view it as one of the most important social institutions, and it, of course, becomes a foundational cultural thing with Nazism, especially further on, both with the fact that a lot of World War I veterans literally comprise the early Nazi movement, and also the fact that the Nazis are considered to be an insignificant alliance with the military, even though Hitler winds up dominating the military in very significant ways as the 1930s go on. But as Matt was saying, you really see significant moves toward democracy in 1918, and particularly in January 19, in which you have this huge strike in Germany, in which it's the famous munitions strike, in which workers begin to demand peace and other domestic democratizing reforms. And this is really critical because it's in this munitions strike that the centers of advocacy become so-called Arbeiterräte, or workers' councils. And these were councils that were centered in factories that begin to exert significant political influence, not only on industrial management, but within Germany itself. And so you have this alternative form of political organization that's not parliaments, that's not, bourgeois constitutional monarchy, but is in fact workers' councils.
Which you did not have at the start of the war, and which was one of those things that inhibited the socialists from resisting the war demands, because they were a parliamentary animal at that point. But yes, the process of fighting the war had not only done a significant job to disillusion a lot of German workers from the prerogatives of the empire, but also to give them direct experience of democratic control of their workplace that they hadn't had before, and with that, a greater confidence that they could assert democratic control of an economy.
And I know we talk about lived experience as in sort of like a funny way sometimes, but in this real way, you could see how the lived experience of war actually leads to new forms of political organization. It's a type of experience that you can't get just through discussion. You actually have to live these sorts of social relations in a meaningful way in order to develop novel forms of political organization. And that's exactly what happens in Germany, particularly as the war grinds on and on and on, and it's pretty clear by 1918 that Germany is not going to win. So what happens in October 1918, the liberal German Prince Max von Baden was appointed Chancellor of Germany. And for the first time in German history, social democratic ministers become part of the German cabinet. And this is really critical because this is where the left begins to split in a significant way. We talked on the last episode about the creation of the Independent Socialists in 1917, but once the social democratic members of the majority Socialist Party become part of the German cabinet, you really get, they become aligned with what is clearly a bourgeois state. Nevertheless, throughout this period, the military continues to dominate German society, and most importantly, there are food shortages throughout the country. And I think this is really critical because there's a lot of talk about revolution in sort of like the online world and even in the off-online world, but it's the material depredations of actual wartime experience that engender a revolutionary consciousness, literal food shortages. You are not getting enough to eat that makes people willing to take novel political action.
Because you have to be in a position where the risk you are taking by opposing the state and by mobilizing militantly against it can be weighed against the risk of not doing that. The risk of continued immiseration, the risk of continued food shortages, the risk of continual falling. And what we have not had in the United States, certainly for most of its post-war history, is any belief that that our lives will be materially, fundamentally made better than we can imagine it in our current moment, because we have access to surplus at all times. We have food. And of course, there is poverty in America, there is hunger in America, but it is a sustained sort of grinding existence for an immiserated and depoliticized population. The center mass of Americans have never experienced a situation where the system as it exists is in danger of no longer providing them with basic necessities. And that is the situation you need to have for people to take the leap into the darkness of revolutionary action on a mass scale.
Cheap food is so important to the maintenance of the status quo. I just want to underline that. It's so important, those basic material necessities. Once they are met, it's very difficult to have radical political action.
Yes.
So what's happening, it's late October, the war's winding down, and the German Navy, in an insane gambit, particularly in retrospect, they decide that they're going to try to attack the British Royal Navy, basically so that they'll be able to re-engender some sort of fighting spirit in the German Navy, of course, at first, but also throughout German society. Things are coming apart at the seams throughout the autumn of 1918, and the answer of the German Navy is to attack the British.
It's a Junker kamikaze attack, basically.
Exactly.
The aristocratic leaders of the Navy, not able to handle a world where they have been defeated, would rather go out in a blaze of glory and be written in history as heroes. But if you're a stiff-necked junker freak in an admiral's uniform, that makes sense. If you're a bosun's mate or a midshipman who's being asked to be annihilated and turned into shark bait in the North Atlantic for no reason, it's a different question.
Exactly, and I think that's also a big difference between the military ruling classes of something like late imperial Germany and the modern United States. These are people who saw valor and sacrifice and romanticism in war. And that is just not the case any longer. And that's probably something we'll return to throughout the show. But these people really thought that they were going to be written in history, that they'll literally go to the halls of Valhalla, sometimes literally, sometimes not literally, and be honored for their sacrifice. And I don't think that really exists any longer.
No. I mean, there is a lot of self-mythology and
yes,
smoke blowing in the military about its honor and duty. But at the end of the day, it's a job.
Right. It's a profession.
It's a profession. And that attitude permeates the entire organization, especially at the top. I mean, the people who are selected for leadership of the modern American military are Peter Principle middle managers, because they're not asked to go out into the field and die for the glory of the country. They're asked to manage imperial conflicts eternally with no actual goal of victory. And in fact, any insistence on resisting the conventional wisdom of whatever engagement they're involved in is met with punishment. What the system now selects for is people who will always tell their superiors what they want to hear, which hollows out any real commitment to anything beyond one's own, as with everyone else in America and everything else in capitalism. It slowly bores its way through all human relations. It replaces every other consideration with personal advancement within the system
and rationalization,
and a rational matrix of decision making. And that system of selection has now filled our entire ruling class at every level with just hollow vessels of personal ambition, and that means that you don't have that romantic, stormy, apocalyptic verve within any of our ruling classes.
Right. And in some sense, these German military leaders really didn't want to live through the war. They imagined themselves as sort of Frederick Barbarossa storming across the fields of Europe, and they thought they were going to die in this big conflagration. But as Matt just said, if you're a normal sailor, you're maybe less willing to do this, and that's in fact what's happened. First in Wilhelmshaven, and then in Kiel, and particularly Kiel is important. A bunch of sailors actually refused to obey this suicide mission, this lost war mission, this kamikaze mission that they knew wasn't going to succeed.
Yeah, and that is very similar to what you see in the Soviet Union or in Russia, the Russian Empire a year earlier. Is the revolution beginning with the refusal of soldiers to carry out self-destructive orders on behalf of this totally alien, aristocratic military ruling class.
And so that's also, again, another thing to point to that really differentiates the modern United States from these sorts of societies, where there was a mass of soldiers who actually had combat experience and were actually willing to put their lives on the line. And I think that just doesn't exist in the modern United States. And again, why I find the talks of a coup of January 6th kind of absurd is because there is no mass of people willing to put themselves on the line to sacrifice their lives for that type of political action.
People won't even sacrifice a paycheck, and it's understandable for them not to, because there's nothing else to believe in but the self and the self-advancement.
And so what happens in this revolution, this sort of great refusal that happens at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, is that the military authorities actually respond to it with violence, and they actually wind up killing several mutineers. But nevertheless, this moment is crucial because the mutineers begin to call for the creation of a republic. And this call for the creation of a republic inspires uprisings first throughout northern Germany, particularly German port cities, and most importantly in Hamburg, which was Germany's second largest city, but also in Bavaria and Munich, and also in Frankfurt am Main. And in all of those cities, local radicals actually take advantage of the declining conditions of German society to spur a revolution that eventually even spreads to Berlin, the German capital. And when it spreads to Berlin, Prince Max von Baden, who again had been appointed, the liberal leader of Germany, in October 1918, sees which ways the winds were blowing, declares that the Kaiser has abdicated, and actually gives his office to the socialist Friedrich Ebert, who is the head of the majority socialist political party. And this is really critical because what you have right now is the majority socialists put in charge of a revolutionary moment. And this is really critical. This is a hinge point. And in fact, within days, the Ebert government passes a number of reforms. Most importantly, he restores civil liberties, and he also institutionalizes the 8-hour workday.
And at the same time he's doing this, he is mobilizing the forces of the state to repress the revolutionary masses wherever they are. He sends Gustav Noske to Kiel to essentially commandeer the mutiny there. He's greeted as a hero by the sailors because they recognize him as a socialist, as a fellow commoner. But then he quickly is able to reassert control by the officers there, and that process is carried out throughout the country, where now with government control, the SDP goes about using it to defend, in a real sense, defend capitalism and to defend the state.
And in particular, what Ebert and Noske really fear is the councils. They fear it because essentially you have a disagreement between parliamentary governance and more organic industrial-based workers' councils. And so they begin to make arguments that the councils are actually importations from Russia, that they're non-German, that the true socialists all recognize that you're going to need to work through parliament. And in so doing, they actually reject these councils, which by late 1918 and early 1919 begin to be comprised of primarily workers and returning soldiers. By February 1919, most of the German army is demobilized, and so you have the return of a lot of soldiers, and many of them actually join these councils. And so you have a disagreement between majority socialists who want to maintain parliamentary control and basically run the state from the top, as Matt gestured to, in line with essentially reactionary forces, both of the radical right, we'll see with the Freikorps, but also with bourgeois capital. And they're rejecting these sorts of organic councils that begin because, throughout Germany, they begin to actually have governing functions. That is, the councils begin to actually exert governing functions. And this is happening throughout late 1918.
And this is where you see the truly poisonous effect of the legitimization of the Social Democratic Party, because as much as there might have been anxiety about foreign importation and tyranny or whatever was the stated objection of the SDP leaders. At the end of the day, they were protecting their positions. They were protecting their positions within a parliamentary party that held commanding heights of power within the electoral apparatus and labor unions. There was no place for them in a movement that was being actually functionally commanded through democratic assemblies within military units and factories.
And so once again, you see the triumph of nationalism over socialism, and you see the power of a nationally organized political party to put down more organic movements, just like similar to what happened in 1914 when the socialists voted in favor of war credits. You see this idea that the only way that capitalism is going to be transcended is through the government, the governing of a national political party. And this is the idea that Ebert and Nasca take with them to the heights of power, and this is one of the reasons they begin to fear the workers' movement. And so what famously happens in January 1919 is the Spartacist revolt, which actually occurred in response to the dismissal of Berlin's police chief, who is actually a member of the independent and, of course, more radical socialist political party. So it's interesting also, we talk a lot about police in the modern United States, but there was a police chief that was, in fact, a radical socialist. So this police chief is dismissed, and then protests begin to be called by the newly formed, just recently formed Communist Party of Germany in alliance with a lot of independent socialists. And so hoping to see the energy of these protests, which were much larger than people anticipated, the revolutionary leader Karl Liebknecht calls for a general strike to actually depose Ebert. So you see again the left, the divisions between the radical and reformist left playing out, with Liebknecht, the leader of the radical left, calling for the deposition of Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the German government and the leader of the socialist political party, the majority socialist political party. And so this, I think, is the real moment, Matt, and I want to hear you comment on it. But basically, in response, what the Ebert government does is that it uses the recently formed right-wing Freikorps to put down the protests. Hundreds of protesters are arrested, and about 150 people were killed. And most famously today, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who were leaders of the radical left, were killed. And after this, the Ebert government continues to put down other revolutionary movements throughout Germany. So this, I think, January 1919 is the real hinge point. That's the moment when the socialists are like, the majority socialists are like, we're going to ally with the state and we're going to really maintain political power. But was there another way? What could they have done? What could the socialists have done, or what could the workers' councils have done in order to engender a different sort of thing?
I think that I agree that January 1919 is the hinge point. I don't know if there's any alternative to the Berlin uprising being put down, simply because of the lack of coordination. It was not a thing that had been planned for. It was largely a spontaneous reaction, which was true of much of the Russian Revolution. Like the mass actions did not begin on a planning table. They began in just the organic response to events, but then the party was there to direct events. And there just simply was not a sufficiently coherent and organized and disciplined force within the rebellious Berlin masses capable of directing the action. There was this expectation in the first days of the Spartacist uprising that there would be this process of taking over control of crucial city installations, and it never happened. There was a lot of milling around, and they kind of just milled around until the Freikorps showed up. And that was because there was not a sufficient organized principle, because all of the real good organizers, all of your Lenins and stuff, were in the fucking Social Democratic Party. The Lenin of 1919 in Germany was Ebert, because the center of gravity of the labor of the socialist movement in the country had been sufficiently bourgeoisified that its organizational capacity was captured by the state. And so, well, I don't think there's any alternative to the Berlin uprising failing. The subsequent domino effect of rebellions that spread throughout the country. And you have the Bavarian Soviet that emerges. You have, after the Cap push, you have the Ruhr uprising. The capacity existed, and the motivation and the organization at the ground level, I think, existed for, in the aftermath maybe of a failed Spartacist rebellion, and in the aftermath of the death of Luxembourg and Liebknecht, I think the historical moment that presents itself is some sort of maybe Soviet aided coordination of efforts instead of what you saw, which is just the spontaneity of the Berlin uprising repeated over and over again,
and then getting cut down.
Yeah,
in the same exact way.
Pieces,
yeah.
In geographically, and then I mean, part of that is frankly a artifact of the fact that Germany had only been a fucking country for 50 years at that point. Like there still is a very distinct regional social reality in Germany at that point.
To the degree where there are actually different royal houses that are overthrown during these late 1918.
The Hohenzollern, the Wittelsbachs go down
famously, and that was actually a big shock. A lot of people thought that maybe the Hohenzollerns would go down, but the Wittelsbachs, because they were so popular, but once they go down, it creates a whole new reality for these people. But I think the question that you're raising is really interesting, because what does it suggest? And what would have been possible as sort of counter guerrilla movements, allied with the Soviet Union, with the Soviets shipping them arms as the Soviet itself the Union itself is undergoing a civil war, as the Allies soon after the war go over. It raises really interesting questions about social organization. And then are we in some sense suggesting that it was always impossible, that there was never going to be a way for these workers' councils to meaningfully enact a political power, essentially, to meaningfully enact governance on a large scale at the level of the nation state? Was Parliament, should they have pursued a parliamentary strategy?
Well, I think at that point, the Parliament, like the democracy that was emerging out of the fall of the Kaiser, was definitionally counter-revolutionary. And as the creation and then utilization of the Freikorps showed, was fully devoted to German militarism in its most savage form. Like there was no hesitation by Ebert and Noske to take the most traumatized, murder-addicted victims of the war and then just set them loose on their own people,
who serve as inspiration to the Nazis, very much so.
And in many cases, the first converts to the Nazi Party. I think that what was lacking was, if not a parliamentary arm, an arm that would have mimicked a parliamentary arm's organizational capacity. Because all of the organizational capacity of the left had been captured, so all was left was the grassroots, and the grassroots will get you the spark, but it cannot pursue a coordinated conflict with capitalism, because by definition it requires coordination, and that coordination within the working socialist movement in Germany had essentially been vacated. It had been bought off and bourgeoisified, and I guess that does suggest that unless you see a significant number of like personnel changes and twists of contingency domino off of one another, it's hard to imagine. But the thing that makes it so enticing as a historical alternative is that I do believe that the sustained and effective resistance that you saw throughout Germany, uncoordinated, and the way that it sparked
genuinely spontaneous
elsewhere, like you had a Soviet, a short-lived Soviet in Hungary.
George Lukács, I believe, was a commissar of culture during that short-lived Soviet.
So, like and there's a civil war in Finland at the same time. The energies are all there. What is lacking is the coordination, and that does make you think that. If I don't know what's specific, it's not like like Lincoln isn't assassinated or like Lenin's train gets derailed on the way to the Finland station. There isn't that sort of...
Or Churchill gets run over by a car, the famous one,
there isn't that hinge point that you can point to, but there is certainly a collection of forces existing to push the moment of crisis to a real conflict with capital, and that if that happens, the outcome really opens up. The historical possibilities open up.
What I think the real other hinge point would have been if Ebert and Noska didn't align with the state.
But that was not going to happen.
So that was overdetermined.
I think that
then it's the bourgeoisification of the party.
Yes,
then this is something that we always have to be afraid of then, because then we're saying that it's overdetermined in the sense that once the party gets those structures, that creates this class of the Dick and Bonzen, the fat cats, that they're going to ally with capital.
And then also what happened over the course of the war, like the Ebert moved closer and closer to collaboration with the non-socialist parties and in the state itself over the course of the war. He started collaborating in the Reichstag much more with the Center Party, and then he was the one who initiated the purging of the party in 1917. And that meant that, but when the time came, when the crisis came, him or anyone who had arisen to that position, given those incentives, was going to view the revolution as an existential threat to themselves, to their position, to everything they imagined, the project that they imagined themselves to be in, which might have, in the recesses of their mind, really been a convinced belief that they were going to get to a parliamentary reformist socialism that was going to overthrow capitalism. And the thing that makes me more than ever convinced of the material determining this more than anybody's beliefs in anything is that how anyone could have gone through World War I and come out the other end convinced that that wasn't the moment, that this was, because Marxism really did have that early Christian millenniary notion that like this is not the long-term battle. This is not an eternal. It's
going to happen in his lifetime.
It's going to happen in his lifetime, just like Jesus said that.
Yeah.
And like you need that in order to be a motivated revolutionary, just like you needed that to be a motivated Christian in those early days. And if World War I wasn't enough to convince you that the millennium had arrived, then you were too well fed to hear the call, basically, and that no contingency of history is going to change that. And even if it did individually, you would be neutralized and replaced. There were plenty of other people ready to take that job of signing over the Socialist Party to the bourgeois.
So, but do you think there was ever a chance of sort of an alliance between the various Arbeiterräte throughout Germany, or an alliance with the Soviet Union? Because the question then becomes, is it just impossible for these sorts of things to take on state power? I mean, that's what the history of the 20th century suggests. And that's why today, I mean, I think revolutionary ideology is essentially just cosplay. But at the time, I just wonder, in sort of the maelstrom of the end of World War I, if they were able to, the Soviet of Munich or whatever aligns with these various other workers' councils before Noska is able to march in with the Freikorps and the representatives of the state, or was it doomed from the beginning? And then, in some sense, I mean, then we're saying that socialism never really had a chance. That it didn't really have a chance against organized state power once it begins a reform, or any sort of reformist political party, which it almost, I would say, necessarily was going to have to do, given the conditions of late 19th century Europe.
I would say the thing that could have done it was not going to be any initiative amongst the different workers' movements, because of the fundamental problem of that, the problem of coordination at that level. It would have been an earlier cap putsch, maybe, because the last real, and the last, in many ways, the most savage of the Civil War, of the German revolutionary conflicts was in the Ruhr Valley after the cap putsch.
Right. Why don't you explain what the cap putsch was and what happened? Because I think this is also a critical moment, because this is often pointed to by the socialists later in the 1920s and early 1930s as what could actually be done within sort of the confines of parliamentary democracy.
Yeah. General
strike stuff.
Right. So the cap putsch occurred, I can't remember the time, I
think it's March 1920.
March. And so after by this point, the Berlin workers had been dispersed. Obviously the Kiel Marines had been dispersed. The Bavarian Social Soviet had been suppressed.
Friedrich is head of the government officially after August 1919.
The Freikorps is well established and at the command of the Social Democrat-led government. When a General Kapp stages, with the aid of a few of the Freikorps leaders, an attempt to seize power in Berlin. And the Social Democratic government flees in the face of this, stunned that their erstwhile military allies would turn on them. It's like, well,
how
what?
dare they?
We're the ones who put down the workers for you. There's no gratitude, which is the real lesson of all of this. Of course, there's no fucking gratitude. They know that they're in a war with you, and you forgot that.
And that's something I want to explore, just like why it seems impossible for socialists throughout the North Atlantic history to recognize that fundamental reality of politics, that you have enemies and that you cannot ally with their enemies because they will destroy you the first second they are able to.
I think it boils down to the fact that what is supposed to keep you sharp and aware of your enemies is your experience of exploitation. And the leaders of parliamentary socialist parties do not have that.
Right.
They do not feel exploited. In fact,
they're
they have
the
the most
PMC.
privileged positions within a society. They get to have bourgeois lives without feeling guilty about it, as we talked about last time. So,
I gotta love it though.
So in those moments, when it comes to the real conflict, when it's you might be risking imprisonment, death, or you win, and then you have to build something new. Oh my God, that's even scarier than dying. The lure of the idea that, well, we'll get them next time. We'll pass a few bills to limit the workday, and we'll increase social insurance, and then in 10 years they'll vote us in, and we'll just abolish capitalism with a bill, and they'll go away. They'll say, you got us.
I wonder to what degree they even believe that, because that's so absurd. It just must be a lot of it the continuation of privileges.
It's self-motivated. Yeah. It's
self-motivated reasoning.
It's and that's always going to dominate. And like the vision of Marxism is that the self-interest gets your calculus of self-interest is expanded to include a class perspective, and that while you may have that, it is dissolved by encounter with that lifestyle, really the literal lifestyle of being a Dickenbonsend. So they flee. Kapp attempts to rule in Berlin, and the Berlin workers stage a general strike, which starts to extend throughout all of Germany, including in the industrial Ruhr Valley.
And the Ruhr is important because it's in the southwest of Germany. It's the heartland of German industrial society, and I believe it's technically governed by the French.
Yes.
At this point, which is really critical. So in the Treaty of Versailles, France is given essentially administrative control of the Ruhr, and there's actually like sort of counter-guerrilla warfare. I mean, there's guerrilla warfare happening, I believe, in the Ruhr. A recent book came out about that. And so it's a really like sort of important area. It's where the German war machine is made.
Yes, and it has a huge number of industrial laborers who are organized against this reaction, which they now see as endangering the progress that has been made. And not only do they go on strike in the Ruhr, they form military units, these red battalions. And then, thanks to the general strike and the general refusal of the bureaucracy to cooperate with Kapp, Kapp also flees Berlin and says, "Never mind," and the putsch collapses. But so the Berlin workers stand down. But in the Ruhr, the workers decide that that's the last. If they're going to do it anyway, if they're going to coup us if they're going to send the military in anyway, after all of this, then this is the last fight. And what you see throughout this period, and the reason it is so frustratingly periodized in the areas, is because what is occurring is in specific areas, people get to collectively the realization that this is the moment,
right? But at different moments,
yes. And the thing is that by 1920 and by the Kapp putsch, the Ruhr is the last place essentially to uprise. Everyone else has had their uprising and had their leftist movement crushed, had the Freikorps come in, massacre the leaders, disperse the movement, throw people in jail. And so once that means that when the Ruhr rises, it rises alone. The Freikorps is sent in and they massacre the workers of the Ruhr. There's just horrifying stories of Freikorps massacring like Red Cross nurses and stuff. And this is where you see like the real blood frenzy take over. And you see how in the absence of a dream of a class project to overthrow capitalism, all that's left is like this individual death drive
rage
that then
almost,
gets to be formalized into the anti-politics of fascism.
Right. Right. And this is really critical. I just want to highlight that I think when you have this republic started on this insanely violent, insanely shaky way, it doesn't I don't think it overdetermined it. Lots of things have to happen for the Nazis to come to power, but it's not a great thing. No. It doesn't set things going on a good path, like from the very beginning. And this is really problematic, again, because you have to remember, Germany is supposed to be the place where the revolution happened. Germany is the place upon which socialist and eventually communist transformation is supposed to rest. So there's this 1 to 2 year period where things are really in flux, and it's the closing off of that possibility with the end of the Ruhr uprising, with the various putting downs of the uprising in Berlin and elsewhere throughout Germany, that essentially ensures, in some real sense, that it's going to be capitalism.
Yes, I mean, it guarantees that the working class will never be able to cohere again, because you now have the Social Democratic Party, which put down the revolution, and then emerging from this, the Communist Party, which will very reasonably never be able to trust the Social Democrats ever again. Right. I mean, much as the failure of the communists to see the threat of the fascists and ally with the Social Democrats. Of course, the Social Democrats were similarly opposed to any alliance with the communists, but it's hard to imagine after that just bloody charnel house of that crucible period, that ever happening.
And it's also a betrayal. I think it's important to appreciate that these were people who were in the same political party with each other for years, for decades, and sometimes. And so the type of brotherly betrayal, sisterly betrayal that occurs between 1918 and 1920 is really something that lasts throughout the remainder of the Republic. And so you get things like that at some points, the communists allying with the Nazis, or, you know, the famous phrase of social fascism instead of social democracy, which was put by the communists against the Social Democrats. And it's because of this early experience in the Republic where the leading socialists really did use the reactionary right wing to put down left wing radical rebellions.
So that is why, if I'm going to imagine an alternative, a counterfactual history that, if not leads to a socialist victory in Germany, at least allows for a real civil war rather than this series of uprisings that all eventually fell out. It would be some sort of military grasp for power sometime in 1919. Something that would have the effect of universalizing throughout Germany that moment of awareness that, because it is this slow disillusioning over time among the more radical working classes as their understanding of what their leadership is differs eventually from what they're seeing manifested around them, until they get to a point of realizing, they're not going to allow us to vote our way into power.
And this raises a really interesting question, because I once heard someone describe Germany as a country of Milwaukees,
yes.
which means there's a lot of different power centers in different areas of the country, unlike in Russia, where it's Moscow.
Yeah, there's a million mid-sized cities.
Yeah, there's like eight or like Hamburg, Munich, Berlin, Frankfurt, right? Blah, 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 blah. And I think that also the particular composition of German industrial society also leads to that sort of different sorts of moments.
There's no Paris to just flood into.
There's no Moscow. There's no Paris. There's no London, right? Which is where and I think that is also one of the things where you could say that the failure of socialism was overdetermined into just the peculiar construction of a country of Milwaukees.
Yeah. So if we're going to imagine it, which I think we want to do because it's fun, if there's some sort of right-wing military attempt to seize power in 1919 that sets off a more coordinated, if only because they're being motivated by a similar event.
A singular event
that they can mobilize around and not have to worry about coordinating at a level that's impractical from those sort of grassroots organizations. The capacity, I think, existed to turn the revolution into a generalized conflict. What happens then, of course, is an entirely different question. And that is where you get into, the dreamscape, where you imagine the dominoes falling. But I don't think it's too wild to do that, because when you look at the tinder in post-World War I Europe, because we had seen the horrifying monstrosity of the war, and it had totally delegitimized all the governments, and it had led to this traumatizing of this whole generation of young men who now have military experience, most of them from the working class, many of them ready to listen to socialist arguments after having seen the nationalist pieties that they had believed in just trampled into mud.
And experienced this form of socialism in the trenches.
Exactly.
You know, in a real way. It had lived experience of socialism.
And when you combine the Civil War in Finland, the Hungarian Soviet, the mutinies in the French army in 1917, the Inverness Mutiny shortly after the war in England, if Germany goes, even if it doesn't go socialist, if it is able to establish a provisional socialist government in opposition to a German capitalist government, like in Spain, say, or in Russia at this point, which is still in a civil war, I think the pressure from the other powers of Europe to intervene would be absolutely undeniable, but resistance
Exactly.
from the people who would be asked to fight that war
Again.
would be absolutely potentially just a cataclysm.
And instead, what happens is you get the black and tans being sent to Ireland and things like that. You get sort of the escape valve of all of these things. You get the invasion of Russia.
Yeah.
You know, the invasion of the new Soviet Union, rather. And I think that's also a really interesting thing to see. If you could have a type of Kiel inspiration on a continent-wide scale.
Yes.
And I think that would have to be the dreamscape, essentially, right? That there's this rebellion in Germany. There's a provisional socialist government. The French and the British and the Americans, frankly, decide to crush it.
Yeah.
And then there's actual opposition, particularly in France and Britain, from that sort of, now we're going to be redeployed, you know, 7 months later to crush the socialists.
Workers. To not the Kaiser.
Right, not the Hun.
Hun, the workers, like the self-identified, self-articulated working class, among working classes that had been in contact with socialist concepts their entire lives. And the reason I think that at the end of the day, I'm still able to invest hope in the human project is that when I look at that possibility, I see all the reasons that it didn't happen and could not have happened in our world. But those to me are largely the result of happenstance. They are obstacles put by not by human minds, but by incident, and that because that's not determined, because that is a flip of the coin done, you know, over and over again every moment of the day. You can imagine a different lay of the land, and with the same people, with the same historical forces at play, a narrowly different topography of events and geographies. Things could have been different, I think.
And I think that's right. And I think that's something that we're going to return to throughout this podcast. So thanks, Matt. And we'll see you all next time.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Hinge Points. I'm your co-host, Danny Bessner, here as always with Matt Christman. Today, the episode you have all been waiting for, the episode on the Civil War and what might have happened if things had turned out a bit differently. So, Matt, this is really your specialty. So why do you think the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century is such a hinge point in American and global history?
The Civil War is the culmination of a 70-year-long crisis of legitimacy and governance within the constitutional order that had been established after the failure of the Articles of Confederation following American independence. And the Constitution was this hodgepodge of compromises brought together by the merchant elite of the North and the plantation elites of the South.
The intellectuals of the South, which I always found interesting, is that the great minds, you know, Jefferson in particular was a Southern plantation owner. I always found that to be a compelling thing. Whereas the North, I mean, they do have their intellectuals, of course, Hamilton in particular, but you know, they're sort of the industrial might, like John Adams and Sam Adams, are kind of a different thing than the Southern plantation owners.
Well, because the Southern plantation owners were living the Greek ideal life that slave owning was supposed to allow for, where burdened by the need to sustain oneself, a virtuous gentleman could spend his time applying his mind to questions of governance and then coming to conclusions. And of course, that's how we have received that history as Americans, that these geniuses came together and had their brilliant insights on exactly how government should function. But what it was is a situation where none of the states trusted one another. They had an unintegrated ruling class, but none of them had the ability to overawe militarily any of the others. So there needed to be a coming together under a single government with a concentrated power in a federal legislature and executive, which was very threatening to the discrete power of these discrete power holders. And so the document they put together is designed to accommodate private concentrations of power. And
in weird ways. I mean, the 3/5 compromise is a very weird compromise. Like it's a strange document in a lot of senses. And I think that's because you have different political economic orders, and even in some degree, although lesser, different ideological orders trying to reconcile themselves in a single document. You know, this era of constitution making, which emerges from the Enlightenment, and it results in this very tension-filled thing that I think really needed to be resolved at some point.
Yeah, it had to be. And at first, the assumption undergirding the constitutional order was that there would be this general will that every well-intentioned gentleman would pursue, and that is who would fill government. And they would not adhere to any factional interest above a national interest. And they even said explicitly that the constitutional order wouldn't work if factions were introduced, which they immediately did, around geographic areas and around discrete power centers. And the next 70 years are a push and pull of varying intensities between the southern plantation economy and the northern proto-industrial economy. And once plantation slavery becomes as wildly profitable as it was, which was not something that the leaders of the constitutional era anticipated. Many of them assumed that slavery was going to die out. They were largely tobacco planters in the northern area of Virginia, and by that point, the soils was already being depleted. The economy of slavery in the northern tier of the South was already sort of losing its profitability, but the opening of the Black Belt South to cotton planting on large scale just changed the equation completely.
And that's what we think of when we think of Southern plantations. We think of this sort of just before the Civil War, Tara, Gone with the Wind image of the cotton belt of the deep South.
Right. But the constitutional order was made by tobacco planters in Northern Virginia. So the creation of this incredibly profitable cotton economy in the deep South and the concomitant pressure for westward expansion meant that this conflict that the constitutional order papered over eventually became unmanageable. And when a conflict is unmanageable by conventional political institutions, the force has to decide, and it did. And the reason that I think of it as such a crucial moment and a hinge point is that the implication to me of this moment, this massive war that kills, now we think, somewhere like 800,000 Americans at a time when the population was a fraction of what it is now, and destroyed the Southern economy, was the ultimate rebuke to the constitutional order and the ultimate sign that a new order would have to be imposed that took for granted a conception of citizenship that the constitutional order was explicitly designed to prevent being acknowledged.
And I think what's also important to think about in terms of the first half of the 19th century is that it's an era of increasing democratizing energies. Mm-hmm. So I think the Constitution is exactly as you said, designed to protect, particular political economic orders and to basically enable them to come together in a meaningful way so that they wouldn't be just, run over again by the British or the French or, some European empire that is also trying to establish a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. But what happens over the course of the 19th century is you get this almost natural unleashing of democratic energies. So the Constitution was also specifically designed to be really elite run. And I think liberalism as a political ideology is inseparable from an ideal of governance that basically ensures that the demos, the people, don't have an effect on things. And I think this is reflected in the Constitution. And if you look at, for example, the Federalist Papers, all of the writers essentially say that one of the most important things is to ensure that the mob, that the random democratic energies of the populace don't begin to exert an impact on actual governance. But what happens over the course of the 19th century, and I think, from a Marxist perspective, basically as a function of increasing industrialization, the use of new technologies, the need for large numbers of people to actually run this political economy, you get this wide unleashing of democratic energies. So it actually first, interestingly enough, I think happens in Latin America. The Mexican Revolution of 1810 is, I think, a reflection of that. And then, of course, it happens in the United States in Jacksonian America, and the beginning of what might be considered to be modern political parties, in a sense that we would recognize them, with pageantry and people coming together and parades and public displays of mass governance. And this is also something that is happening in relation to and as a consequence of the political economic transformations that are occurring over the course of the first half of the 19th century, with the expansion of the agricultural industry into the Deep South and cotton plantations, and of course the increasing industrialization of the North and the increasing urbanization of the North. And I think this is a theme we see throughout American history, with the divide between urban spaces and more rural spaces as well.
Yes, and the implication of all of this is that the constitutional order is not capable of absorbing that sort of democratic energy. It is designed to diffuse and defeat democratic investment in government. But the army that won the Civil War was the one that was least adherent, least faithful to the Constitution as it was conceived of. I mean, the South was correct in the sense that they were the ones who were guardians of the true Constitution, I think, in that the Constitution as an elite document meant to maintain elite control of governance. The Southern states before the Civil War were the least democratic internally. They were the ones where the franchise was most restricted and where government was held in the most concentrated hands. The Northern states were the ones where, as soon as the Constitution is promulgated, you see a rush towards expansion of democratic institutions in states like Pennsylvania, and then following suit in other states after that. And the army that wins the Civil War is this massive democratic army, sort of a American version of the French Revolutionary Army, and commanded by, I think this is sort of telling, commanded by commoners. The Army of Northern Virginia versus the Army of the Potomac at the end of the war, the battle to take Richmond, is between an army led by a deep in his bones Southern aristocrat, Robert E. Lee, and a failed tanner from Ohio. Abraham Lincoln was a child of the frontier. The democratic machinery of the North, both in the military and in government, was now producing this real people's government, and they won the war. And then, thanks to a number of factors, some of them deeply embedded, but some of them wildly contingent, the next step in addressing the incompatibility of the constitutional order with democratic society was not taken. And instead, the Constitution, while it was amended in a way that was at the time radical, its fundamental structures were maintained such that within a generation, even those radical Republican Reconstruction amendments are turned towards the purpose of defending the emerging corporate powers that will then dominate the government for the next 200 years.
And I think just to be clear, Matt's referring to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were famously called the Reconstruction Amendments. And I think that the failure of these amendments to prevent relatively quickly the collapse of Reconstruction and the emergence of a Jim Crow South that effectively lasts until the 1960s really highlights the limits of legislation and formal law and affecting life on the political ground. So I think it's important, before we get to the aperture that begins to open with the Civil War, why don't you set the scene of what's going on in the 1850s? What are the interests and who are they fighting? What are they fighting amongst themselves? Because this basically sets the stage for what happens during and after the Civil War.
So by the 1850s, the slavery issue, which the second party system, the Democrat and the Whig parties that emerged out of the Jacksonian era, had a vested interest in suppressing the slave issue. There was famously a gag rule in the House of Representatives forbidding the submission of abolitionist petitions to government. They didn't want to talk about it. They all had other agenda items, other policies that they cared about, and they did see clearly that slavery, if it became the central pivot of American politics, could only lead to disunion because it could not be resolved through the constitutional order. But by the 1850s, the war in Mexico and then the question of Kansas and Nebraska becomes so overwhelming that slavery becomes the single issue that all American politics pivots around. And in that context, the second party system collapses. The Whig Party, which was the party of Northern industry broadly, but also it was the party of internal improvements. It was the party of the emerging bourgeois throughout the country. And
the professional managerial class, in a real way, the proto-PMC, the people who are going to start managing things in an increasingly complex political economy.
Yeah. So in the 1850s, the prospect of slavery expanding into all of the new territory acquired through the Mexican War and also into above the Missouri Compromise line really brought home to Northerners who, until that point, were broadly hostile to abolitionism, broadly hostile to the moral argument against slavery. It brought to them the fear that the United States would eventually be dominated entirely by the planter class, the slaveocracy, as it was called.
And that's really critical, because I think they're really freaked out about the rise of European industrialization. Because I think you could understand the, the announcement of the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s and, the Mexican-American War to some degree to be the United States essentially asserting itself against the emergence of increasingly powerful European empires, and in particular the British Empire. Now we're great friends with the British, but in the middle of the 19th century, there were real fears that these European empires would begin to encroach on American territories. And so I think at the time, people were worried, if we're centering political economy, people were really worried about the United States being a backwards, anti-developmentalist political economy, and a political economy that would rely on slavery as it expands westward, displacing the potential of the industrial might of the North. And I think that's a really critical issue to highlight when understanding one of the reasons why the Civil War proceeded as it did.
And there's also the fear that if slavery became the dominant political economy in the United States, that it would eventually be something that all Americans would have to compete with, and that the promise of yeoman self-sufficiency and free labor would be dissolved, that all would have to, in some way, become integrated into a slave economy. And that took an issue that had been mostly a moral one among urban Protestant reformers and made it a popular issue.
Right. A material issue. Once things become material, all of a sudden everyone becomes interested.
Yes. And once this happens, once there is this significant shift in priorities, political priorities among the Northern farmers and laborers, then the second party system becomes absolutely unsustainable. And the first party to break up under its pressure is the Whigs. And the Whig collapse occurs simultaneously with the emergence of the Republican Party, which is the first mass party in the United States dedicated to the central issue of limiting, if not abolishing, slavery. There had been previous parties that had attempted to organize around those principles, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and they had had some successes and won local elections, but had never made a national impact. As soon as the Republicans emerge on the scene, the Whig Party loses its raison d'etre, basically, and for the first time, there is a anti-slavery party in the North. And the grandees of politics in the United States were terrified of this because they rightly saw it as the death knell for the constitutional order, because the slavery issue simply could not be resolved through democratic means.
And there's an irony here, I think, and it relates to American land. So whereas for a lot of American history, from the beginning down until today, land has served as an escape valve for social conflict. You could let off a bit of steam by allowing the immigrants who come into the urban spaces in the Northeast to, move west and make their own way in the world. But here is an instance in which the adding of land to the American public actually starks social tensions, because there is an irreconcilable conflict between two very different approaches to political economy. Are you going to be a major industrial power in the world? Are you going to be producing manufacturers for the world through the extraction of raw materials you have on your national territory, of course, but are you going to be producing manufacturers for the world? Or are you going to be a political economy that extract solely raw materials for export to the rest of the world? Are you going to have King Cotton, as it was called at the time, be the foundation of the political economy of the United States? And this becomes a live question in the 1840s and the 1850s because you get an incredible, just a sheer, an incredible amount of land added to this country in an incredibly short period of time. So tensions are heightened in the 1840s and 1850s after the Mexican-American War of 46-48. And then Kansas and Nebraska in the 1850s, tensions are heightened to such a degree that things are pushed to a breaking point that they hadn't been in the previous 70 years when social tensions could really be tamped down in meaningful ways.
Yes, because the one thing that had until this point been the ultimate reliever of social conflict, westward expansion, was now the source of the conflict. Now the question of who is going to be allowed in the new westward expanses, who is going to be able to settle, was the central question of politics, which meant it could no longer serve as the central alleviator of social tension. So that meant that America left the stage where the governing assumption of power was that any real social conflict could be alleviated through the access of land. Now, with land being the central issue, the fundamental undergirding premise of constitutional order goes away, and all that's left is the shooting. And so the South, as soon as a Republican president is elected, with the connivance of many fire eaters in the South who sought the destruction of the Democratic Party in order to ensure that, because they were so certain that the only way that the South could survive was alone, that means that secession becomes inevitable, war becomes inevitable, and then over the course of 4 bloody years, the United States government, which had been largely hindered in its development of internal mechanisms of power by that very Constitution and by the fiat of Southern power, erupts. The United States gets its first national currency, which is a fiat currency, the greenback, and it uses that to fund a huge expanse in government power and coordinating ability. And it is with that machinery, the Yankee Leviathan, they call it, that they were able to destroy the Southern resistance. And with that, the eventual recognition came in the North that slavery would have to be ended. And by the end of the war, the unified war aim of the North is the abolition of slavery. The live question, though, is what that means. What are the implications of these millions of formerly enslaved people who were explicitly written out of the social contract now being brought into it? And that is the question that Lincoln and the radical Republicans were addressing themselves to when Lincoln is assassinated.
And so, again, I think this is a theme that we've seen throughout these episodes, which is that war is crucial to state making. So it's really the Civil War that begins to make the modern American state in a real way. This the type of military state, the type of legal state, this type of economic state that would be able to, over the course of the later 19th and early 20th centuries, begin to assert itself on the world stage. And I think another crucial thing to recognize about the Civil War is that you also begin to see a concentration of power in the executive. And this is why a lot of libertarians, throughout history have always stressed the Civil War as, the moment when things went wrong, even though they're nominally committed to liberty. And there's nothing, more not committed to liberty than chattel slavery. But they point to the concentration of power in the executive and in Lincoln himself as basically the moment the United States takes a wrong turn. And probably most famously is Lincoln did suspend habeas corpus, the legal rights to a trial in a particular way, that he genuinely did suspend during the Civil War. So you begin to see two things. You begin to see the creation of this state structure that will slowly be able to, govern the United States itself in a meaningful way and eventually expand imperially from sea to shining sea, and then across the border, and the ever more increasing of power in the executive himself. But before we talk about the implications of the Civil War, do you think, and this is a question I go back and forth on, do you think the outcome of the Civil War was overdetermined? Was it impossible for the South to win, or could there have been, a British Southern alliance that would have provided the South with the necessary, material that would have enabled it to confront the North and prevent, in particular, the Northern blockade of the South? Or were things doomed from the beginning because, the Britain of the Victorian era is never going to lie with a slave-holding society? I think it's a question I go back and forth on, but curious what you think.
I think that there were a few very narrow apertures where there was a potential for a Southern victory. I'd say by 1863, it's inevitable that the North will win. I don't think that you can really imagine that any other outcome at that point. I would say that the high point of the Confederacy's chances were Robert E. Lee's 1862 invasion of Maryland, which ends with the Battle of Antietam. And
is that the bloodiest battle in American history?
It's the bloodiest single day.
The bloodiest single day. That's
and
what it is. Yeah.
Amazingly, it happened because the orders that Robert E. Lee had given to his commanders were found by a Union patrol. And amazingly, McClellan was only able, with that information, to get a draw out of it, which one of
boggles the mind, really.
Infuriating things about George McClellan. But if that had gone differently, if he'd been able to strike up into the North at a time before the Emancipation Proclamation had been announced, there is a chance there that a combination of collapse in Northern morale and perhaps a recognition from Great Britain or France could have secured some sort of political settlement in favor of the Confederacy. But that was still a long shot, and I do think that that was a live option. But in general, the longer it went on, the more inevitable Union victory was going to be. Unless Northern will to fight was defeated, and it never was.
And I think that highlights the importance of industrialization to the winning of wars beginning of the 19th and 20th century. So you begin to see a new factor of war, and that's literally the ability to produce things. And you begin to see the rise of a new form of war that we call today total war, where all of society is mobilized in a meaningful way to produce, to provide soldiers, and to support the will of the executive in power. And I think the Civil War is really important for that introduction of these new material factors into war. And it's a hinge point in that sense. It really foreshadows a type of mechanized war that would reach its apotheosis in World War I and World War II. I think has really begun. You should see elements of it in the Napoleonic Wars, but it's really the Civil War. You know, I think it's the first machine gun, you know, the first steel-plated ships, and the new technological developments that indicate that wars will be something different in the 19th and 20th centuries, and particularly they'll have much higher casualty rates than they did in the past.
Yeah, and that was the thing that shocked all society at the time. A Southern senator, I believe, boasted before the war started that he would be willing to drink all of the blood that was shed in the coming conflict because of the overriding assumption that it would be one way or the other relatively quick and relatively bloodless. Instead, you had 4 years of unprecedented bloodshed, and it had the effect of, over the course of the war in the North, sort of consecrating the cause, because while slavery was obviously the cause of the war in any meaningful sense, the social mission at the beginning of the war in the North was to save the Union. Like, the Union is an abstract concept, the Constitution is an abstract principle that needed to be defended.
Right. And these United States becomes the United States, famously, right? And before the war, they referred to as these United States. After the war, it's just referred to the United States as a singular entity.
But by the end of the war, the sacrifice that had been endured was so massive that those abstract concepts didn't have the power to consecrate them. So by the end of the war, among the Union Army and among the Northern electorate broadly, it was well understood that this was a war to end slavery, to abolish this monstrous institution of inhumanity. And there was a real consensus that there would have to be a continuation of the struggle, once the battles were over, to remake the South in a real way, to make liberty a real thing for the former slaves. And that was the tenor of the moment when the 13th Amendment is passed, formally abolishing slavery at the very beginning of 1865, and which is the question that was in Lincoln's lap, the question of Reconstruction, when he was assassinated.
So that's the big hinge point.
Yes.
So why don't we, you know, as they say in Shakespeare, exit from stage right Lincoln, enter Andrew Johnson.
Oh boy.
So who is he, and why does he do what he does? And then I want to use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about Reconstruction, but then to bring in Butler, because I think Butler is this aperture that really things could have gone in a lot of different ways. So who's Andrew Johnson? Why did Lincoln choose him as the VP? And what is his effect on Reconstruction?
So Andrew Johnson is the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union after secession. He was a senator from Tennessee. He was a son of the poor white yeomanry. He was a tailor by profession who had risen through the ranks of Tennessee politics as a tribune of the white people broadly. And in defiance and in opposition to the planter aristocracy that dominated Tennessee as it dominated all Southern political society. And when the war breaks out, he alone among Southern senators stays loyal to the Union, becomes later the military governor of Tennessee when it's occupied by the Union. And
very early on in the war, yes, which is always funny when you go to Nashville, they have all this Civil War stuff. But I think 1862 is when they're occupied.
Yes. And Johnson is, while governor, he's noted for his harsh treatment of rebels, for his solicitation towards former slaves, for his steadfast loyalty to the Union. And for those reasons, he is put on the ticket for the Republicans in 1864, who are seeking at that point to broaden their mandate beyond Republican voters.
They're looking toward the end of the war, essentially.
Yes, they're trying to heal the divide and try to and
bipartisan consensus.
Exactly. I mean, they don't even run as the Republican Party. Lincoln runs on the National Union ticket, and they replace abolitionist Northerner Hannibal Hamlin with, they wanted a Democrat of some kind, and they ended up with Johnson, the most prominent Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Northern cause. And when Lincoln is assassinated, there is this assumption that Johnson's going to be incredibly harsh on the South because of his record as military governor. But he very quickly imposes a policy of almost complete forgiveness of the slave power, of the planter class. Essentially, what he wants is for all of the planters who were disdainful and contemptuous of him during his political career to come to him in Washington and ask nicely for their citizenship back. And whenever they did, he would, because his resentment of the planter class was always entirely personal. It was a sense of individual narcissistic aggrievement that he was not seen as an equal by these fancy pantses. And that put him in a position of being always just deeply insecure about his own social standing. And once president, surrounded largely by these contemptuous Republicans, he immediately flees to the arms of the former Confederates. And he initiates a reconstruction that attempts to reestablish the status quo before the war, minus slavery, but with all of the social structures around race caste maintained. Because as an insecure, lower class Southerner, Johnson was fixated on his position relative to black people, his position and the position of others like him as not being on the same degraded level as slaves, which meant that the social stratification of slave society had to be maintained. And in my mind, the most consequential things he did during the first year of presidential Reconstruction, when, thanks to the Constitution at that point, there was no Congress in session, and he was essentially able to dictate terms from the White House, was to reenfranchise rebels, and also, I think most crucially, to reverse any land redistribution to former slaves that had gone on till that point. And there was some significant movement in that direction. Sherman's March to the Sea had led to a huge refugee army, basically, of former slaves following the Union Army. And in order to reduce the number of mouths he had to feed, basically, Sherman settled a lot of these former slaves in areas around the Sea Islands and the coast of South Carolina on former plantation land. And Johnson set about very quickly evicting them. And evicting and breaking up any concentrations of black land ownership that had emerged in the ad hoc system of contraband management that had carried on throughout the Union Army. And eventually, the radical Republicans come back into power, and they dictate the radical Reconstruction over the vetoes of Johnson. But all of that action happens in a context that has been determined by Johnson and that subsequently can never really be reversed.
Right, because of the land, right?
Yeah.
The fundamental realities of the land remain relatively coherent. And this is true, interestingly enough, I think throughout the 19th century world. In Russia, in Latin America as well, it's land redistribution and the lack of a land redistribution that allows basically fundamental political, economic, material relationships to remain relatively coherent, and the social relations that emerge from them to remain relatively coherent. So even though slavery is, of course, formally abolished, you have the institution of Jim Crow, which essentially keeps the race caste system, as you were saying, going for another 80 plus years. So it's really that aperture of the post-Civil War moment that gets closed relatively quickly with the lack of, massive land redistribution. But things could have been different, right? And let's introduce Butler.
Yes.
So who was Butler, and why is this probably one of the most important missed moments in modern history?
So Benjamin Butler was another Democrat. He had been a doughface in the pre-war Massachusetts Party. He'd always been an ally to workers. He made his career in Lowell, representing the interests of garment workers there. But like many Northern Democrats, he was very happy to ally with the interests of the Southern planter class on slavery, as long as they allowed him to pursue his provincial interests, where he actually was seeking to wield power. In fact, in 1860, he ran for governor in Massachusetts on the ticket of John Breckinridge, who was the breakaway Southern Democrat candidate for president, not even on the Douglas. He was, in fact, mad at Douglas for not compromising enough with the slave power to prevent the party from breaking up.
And this is a story about you have to allow growth, in one's life.
That's just it, is that Johnson spent his career as this politician just curdling on his own resentments, whereas Butler, when the war begins, secures a political commission as a general, commands troops in Virginia and in Louisiana, and very early on is presented with the question of what to do with escaped slaves who run to his lines, because wherever a Union army would appear in the South, nearby plantations would empty as slaves sought freedom behind the Union lines. And in the very early days of the war, the Union policy was to return slaves to the plantations. Butler claimed them as what he called contraband of war, and then put them to work not only doing manual labor in the camps, but also started to organize them into military units. Then he became the military governor of New Orleans, where he encountered the hatred and savagery of the occupied Confederate whites with just a growing sense of anger and contempt. He famously issued a proclamation ordering that any Southern lady who failed to show proper respect for a Union soldier to be treated as a woman plying her avocation, which is another word for prostitute. He was so hated that the local whites called him Beast Butler. They called him Spoons Butler because he was accused of stealing silverware from prominent Confederate families, which he did. He was a crook too, is the other thing. He was a classic mid-19th century patronage type politician.
Graft politician, yeah. Which if only we had more of that today instead of the technocracy where just denies people stuff.
It was an element of democracy is the thing. It wasn't just corruption.
And that's important to underline. I think that really is an element of democracy. This sort of distribution of patronage, the distribution of goods is actually crucial to democratic functioning, at least historically. And so the replacement of those sorts of things with technocratic governance as the result of the progressive era of the turn of the 20th century, I think has resulted in a lot of things that are negative. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
So Butler is eventually recalled from New Orleans because he created such a stir and so much outrage. Even he created international incidents, even in one case, hanging a man who had pulled down an American flag and stepped on it. But when he came back north, he was feted not by the Democrats, who now thought of him as a horrible monster, but by the Republicans. And so he switched his party allegiance to the Republicans. And he, I think most importantly, had experience during the war of actually commanding black troops in battle and experiencing, that reality.
And the creation of brotherhood. I mean, I think it's difficult to appreciate in a political moment where so few people serve, but the bonds of war are genuine and they're real, and they have served as progressive forces throughout modern history. And I think this is one of the moments where you see someone recognizing the humanity and empathizing with people about whom he knew very little due to the exigencies and realities of the awfulness of war.
So by 64, he is much more sympathetic to Black Americans than he had been, and wildly less sympathetic to Southern whites than he had been, specifically rich Southern whites.
Yeah, growth, emotional growth.
But because of his reputation as this Democratic doughface, he was offered the vice presidential spot before Johnson was.
Yeah, so let's underline that. He was offered the spot.
Yes.
So this is like, again, moments where binary 1-0 yes-no decisions actually do have enormous impact on history, and it raises interesting philosophical questions about structure versus agency and where one operates when, because on this podcast, and I think as a general approach, it's important to really emphasize structure, particularly in this political moment, in the neoliberal moment where agency is overemphasized, but there really are moments where individual actors in history make choices and things go a different way than they would have otherwise.
Yes. In his biography, Butler says that he told Simon Cameron, who had offered him the spot, that he would only take it if Lincoln agreed to die 3 months into the term.
Little did he know.
And he turned it down also because at that point, the vice presidency was not considered a route to greater power. It was considered the end of a career. And also, he wouldn't be able to be a lawyer again if he'd been vice president, because that would have been undignified. So,
i.e., he wouldn't have been able to make money.
Exactly. So
right.
he turned it down, and they went to Johnson instead. And this, I think, is an incredibly important aperture, because if Butler becomes vice president and then is president, assuming Lincoln is still assassinated in that universe, you would have had in office someone fully committed now to a radical reordering of society in the South, someone who showed a willingness throughout his career, both before this and in our world after this, to be vengeful against assaults on the dignity of the United States and of former slaves.
Yeah, the dignity of freedmen.
Yeah. So in the real world that we had, Butler becomes, after the assassination, a radical Republican congressman from Massachusetts, and becomes one of the key figures in passing all the most important civil rights legislation after the war. But I think crucially, he also becomes one of the most prominent Republicans to embrace soft money. And I do think that the question of currency ended up being incredibly important to the destiny of Reconstruction. So Johnson's time of presidential Reconstruction is immeasurably harmful to the project of Reconstruction. But what really kills it, what really puts a stake in the heart of Reconstruction, is one, obviously, the violent resistance of Southern whites, which was only spottily repressed by the Union Army and occupying forces, but also the collapse of the economy in 1872, which
the first Great Recession,
which
right,
was,
of 72, 73.
Which was responded to by a deflationary movement towards the gold standard, which was carried out by the elites of the Republican Party, who wanted to end slavery because it was a violation of their liberal principles of individuals competing in a free market, but who had no interest in a social revolution. But there were Republicans during that era who were fully willing to continue spending money that was not backed by gold, like Benjamin Wade in the Senate, but also Benjamin Butler, and a soft money Reconstruction that was dedicated to land redistribution and defending freedmen's rights, I think would have applied pressure on the constitutional system that would have required a real reckoning with it, and would, I think, have rearranged the political landscape of the United States. And we would not have had the situation that we got, which is a pact between the Democrat and Republican parties to essentially sacrifice the formerly enslaved people on the altar of progress, the reification of the robber baron capitalism as the predominant model of growth, and a partisan system where people essentially voted against the party that shot their dad or whatever during the war, but without any further ideological valence other than that. And a Butler regime that comes into office waving the bloody shirt, not of an anonymous freedman or scalawag, but of Abraham fucking Lincoln himself, decapitates the Southern slaveocracy, dispossesses.
Right. I think that's crucial. The dispossession, I think, is critical.
Dispossesses the slave
like
power.
a denazification effort that actually happens.
Right. And then redistributes land. Now, think Butler as president guarantees that those processes lead to some, vast
Utopia,
acceleration of social forces so that, you don't have racist backlash, you don't have violence, you don't have the perpetuation of racism into the 20th century. I think all those things are baked in to the pie of America at that point. But the trajectory, the speed, and the shape of conflict, I think, would be radically different. And
you might see something like the Civil Rights Act of the mid-1870s pass.
Well, that's the thing, is that
like stuff like that. You might see the formalization of these types of genuine civil rights laws.
Because all of the stuff that got passed in the 1860s was on the table, and in some cases was passed, although it was then rendered toothless by lack of enforcement and then Supreme Court rulings. It was all on the table in the 1870s. And in Butler administration very well could have seen them not only passed, but enforced at the point of a gun by the government. And in a situation like that, I think that the reactionary forces that end up at every turn in American history battening down all of the progressive eruptions and potentials of the moment might be deflated. The way I think of it is that we live in the world where we get Johnson after Lincoln, and then we get Truman after FDR. And those two hinge points both push us in one direction.
In pretty bad directions.
Yeah. But I think that if you have Butler as VP, then you probably still have capitalism in America. You probably still have the rise of the industrial capitalist conflict in Europe. You have a massive conflagration in the first half of the 20th century. But by the end of that conflict, maybe you have a president who, maybe he isn't FDR, but he is a similar figure who is replaced by a figure like Henry Wallace, for example. Maybe they aren't Democrats. Maybe that's the Socialist Party.
And I think here it's an interesting way to think about it. It's what does American liberalism become? Liberalism could have conservative, and liberalism could have more left-wing variants. And the history, as it turned out, I think pushed us to the right of liberalism as a phenomenon. An emphasis on empire, an emphasis on individual rights, an emphasis on exchange and things like that line. But with literal different people pushing different policies, you could have had a more humane liberalism. I think socialism, at least in the United States, would have always been difficult because the land question just makes things more difficult here, generally speaking. But you could have had a kinder, gentler liberalism that might have pushed in a more genuinely social democratic direction, particularly if there was a way to unite the northern white working classes with the freedmen much earlier than happened in which Elizabeth Cohen talks about in her New Deal book. It talks about in the 1930s. What if that happened in the 1870s or 1880s? You have total new social relations and social constitutions that just didn't happen, partially because of who was president at the time.
Yeah, because you have the embers of those things there, but they're all stamped out by these overdetermining factors. And I could just see a situation where the two main parties that emerge from a more progressive Reconstruction are not the Republicans and Democrats, with very little ideological distinction between the two, defined almost entirely by region and by the history of who fought who in the Civil War, but maybe the Republicans or the Democrats and the Socialist Party. Now,
it allows for a socialist alternative to arise genuinely.
Exactly.
Because people are pushed toward it from the left side of liberalism. It's more of an opening for that sort of alternative.
And, by the mid-century, it's probably still a socialist party that is functionally capitalist, but just that reality of it being a socialist party, of it being organized around ideological principles and of self-aware class project means that in that big reckoning moment that happened after, in our world, World War II, there would have been more social power behind a alternative to Cold War, continuation of military buildup and neocolonialism in the developed world. And who knows what that leads to, but it does feel like there's two parallel Americas, one where we get Johnson and Truman, and one where we get Butler, and because we got Butler, we get
a Wallace type figure.
And then who knows?
And that also raises interesting questions, and we could close on this, but let's say there's genuine land redistribution in the United States of the 1870s and the 1880s. What does that say about populism, right? Because let's say there's a recent history of people democratically taking control of the land. You could see new alliances between, populists, freedmen, northern workers that were just closed off with the total catastrophe of Reconstruction as it actually proceeded.
In the teeth of the wild racial reaction of the post-war era, there still were effective political coalitions between former slaves and populists throughout the South, and they were suppressed at the barrel of a gun, most famously the Wilmington coup in North Carolina. And there was the Readjusters Coalition in Virginia, which was spearheaded by a former Confederate general, but was a coalition of populist whites and former slaves. That happened even in the
awful,
world.
Horrible reaction of the racist South.
Yeah, but imagining a world where the nascent alliance between former slaves and poor whites who had opposed the Confederacy, which was a significant number of them, that did exist in embryonic form after the war, is nurtured. A redistribution of land that encompasses both former slaves and poor whites occurs. The end of slavery is seen by not just former slaves, but by the common white people as a positive social good. That takes a phenomenon that happened anyway in the miserable conditions of deflationary robber baron late 19th century, and gives resistance to those currents, the wholesale purchasing of this new government structure by capital that happens after the war. It gives it a teeth, and it gives it a spine of resistance that didn't exist in our history.
And it's a genuine democracy. And I think it's important to make clear, we're not saying that like racism would go away.
Right, yeah, no.
What we're saying is that there were particular constellations of interests that could have resulted in people meeting each other and developing the social relations that over time would have led to an attenuation of the horrible hatred that existed within the country during and after the Civil War.
And crucially, I think it would have pushed for a reckoning with our political institutions. And it would have meant
we never
that
got.
The Constitution, as we understand it, would, over time, I think, been radically broken up.
And I just want to make clear very quickly, we're one of the only countries in the North Atlantic that is still operating off of its original Constitution, even with amendments. That is fucking insane.
Yeah. And I think a structure like that means that the political forces that are available and that mobilize when you have that early 20th century capital crack up, that's happening in any universe.
Right, definitely.
That the response to it, instead of people basically as the only place to effectively put their energies being voting for this Democratic Party that is structurally committed to capital throughout all of its
various iterations.
Yeah, like, and at every level of power, and that just kind of absorbs all of this popular energy and does change the party, but not sufficiently. You have a situation where maybe the party that exists to channel that energy is one that is explicitly oriented in hostility to capitalism.
Right. So I think what would have happened, not necessarily, but what could have happened with Butler is you get the formation of a cross-class, cross-race demos that is able to serve as a counterweight to capitalism, as opposed to what happened in our real world, where that just didn't, those social relations never formed. So there was never that sort of offset to capitalism that might have otherwise existed.
And I think you don't even need to imagine Butler presiding over some enlightened anti-racist project. All you really would have needed to keep the northern populace on board with a really radical reconstruction from the get-go is these fuckers killed 500,000 of your fellow citizens and Abraham Lincoln. Let's fuck them up. Let's hang them from the goddamn posts. I certainly sure shit don't think that Benjamin Butler was president, that Jefferson Davis would have gotten 2 years in the clink and then gotten to write a self-explanatory memoir. And I think that goes for the entirety of the leadership of the Confederacy. And it absolutely would have meant a punitive confiscation of property from the people who, everyone at that point understood, started the goddamn war in the first place.
I know it's also really interesting because, we're having fun here, but imagine a Nuremberg-esque trial in the post-Civil War United States where you get, instead of the antecedents for crimes against humanity happening in 1945, what if something like that happened in 1865? I don't think it would have been enforceable, right? But you could imagine new ideas and new ways of looking at the world being generated from those sorts of punitive post-war actions, where you actually, as a society, come together and say that, this is not acceptable. These sorts of crimes are not acceptable by quote unquote civilized society. So you get the formation of an earlier type of international law, and maybe it wouldn't have been so toothless as it turns out to have mostly been.
Yeah, there was a villain that would have been.
Yeah, there were genuine villains.
There was an entire class of people who everyone understood were the villains of the story that they had just endured. But for Johnson, and then later for the reactionary capitalist Republicans who dominated the party, absent any leadership in the executive, especially after they install U.S. Grant, who did some very good things to defend former slaves' rights, but was at the end of the day a cat's paw for the hard money, pro-corporate Republican Party. For them, diffusing that responsibility was crucial, because the project of creating a multiracial democracy with a redistribution of land and power downward was just antithetical to their interests.
And with no social base basically balancing against them, there was no real way for it to go otherwise.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone, for listening to Hinge Points. If only Butler had been the VP instead of Johnson, things would have got differently, and we really appreciate it. Bye.